October 24, 1944. The waters off Samar Island lay silent under a starless sky. The Philippine Sea was calm, almost tranquil, as if unaware that within minutes it would witness one of the most violent displays of firepower in human history. Just after midnight, the radar operators aboard the USS Iowa detected faint echoes to the west, large fast-moving contacts emerging from the darkness. They were Japanese heavy cruisers, part of Admiral Kurita's center force withdrawing after the chaotic battle off Samar. For the men on Iowa's bridge, it was the moment they had been waiting for. Inside the ship's plotting room, engineers hunched over mechanical fire control computers, giant analog brains of steel and gears feeding in data from radar wind sensors and rangefinders. A red light blinked on the Mark 8 radar display range, 35 kilometers. Bearing confirmed. The target likely the cruiser Kumano, moving north at 25 knots. Captain John McCrea gave the order that would echo across the Pacific. All batteries stand by for full salvo. The men in Turret 1 braced themselves. Each of the 9 16-inch Mark 7 guns weighed as much as a locomotive. The shells inside them, 2,700 pounds apiece, were loaded with meticulous precision. When the firing key turned, the shockwave rolled through 57,000 tons of steel. The night exploded in orange light. The concussion flattened the sea around the bow. Observers on nearby ships said it felt like the ocean itself had been punched. 40 seconds later, the horizon erupted. Through binoculars, spotters saw a distant flash, followed by another, then a column of flame climbing hundreds of feet into the air. The first shell had struck home. One officer whispered, "Good God, we hit her." But there was no celebration, only silence and the low rumble of machinery resetting the guns. Within minutes, 5 more shells followed, each guided by radar corrections, each one finding steel somewhere in the darkness. On the Japanese side, chaos. Aboard the cruiser, Kumano officers stared in disbelief as explosions tore through their aft section. They hadn't heard aircraft nor seen any incoming torpedoes. The sky was empty. Then came the thunder delayed by the vast distance rolling across the sea like a god's drumbeat. The gunnery officer shouted, "Impossible, no ship can fire from that far." Yet 6 American shells had crossed 21 miles of open water and found their mark with mechanical precision. In those few minutes, the myth of invincibility surrounding Japan's naval surface forces began to unravel. What their admirals did not yet realize was that this was not a lucky strike. It was the inevitable result of mathematics, radar, and industrial perfection converging at sea. The Iowa's fire control system did not guess, it calculated. It measured humidity, wind, and the curvature of the earth itself. Every shell was not just fired, it was engineered to arrive. When the echoes faded, the Pacific returned to silence, but nothing about it was the same. Aboard Iowa, the deck still trembled. The gunners wiped sweat and soot from their faces, their ears ringing from the blast. Somewhere beyond the dark horizon, a Japanese cruiser burned unseen, its crew stunned that they had been struck by an enemy they could not even see. The night the sea shook was more than a battle. It was a revelation that in 1944 America had turned physics into a weapon, and that distance no longer offered safety. The story of the Iowa-class battleship began long before that night off Samar. In 1938, as the clouds of war thickened over the Pacific, American engineers were already sketching something radical, a battleship that could keep pace with aircraft carriers and strike farther, faster, and harder than anything afloat. The result was not just another warship. It was a machine built to turn physics into strategy. Each Iowa class was a city of steel and electricity. At 887 feet long, displacing nearly 58,000 tons at full load, the ship was both elegant and terrifying. Her 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 guns were the most advanced naval artillery ever constructed. Each one could hurl a shell the weight of a small automobile over 23 miles with pinpoint accuracy, guided by a fire control computer system that turned raw data into destruction. At her core sat the Mark 8 and Mark 13 radar rangefinders, rotating eyes that pierced rain darkness and smoke. Unlike earlier ships that depended on human eyesight, the Iowa could see through night and chaos alike. The concept was simple: let the machines think faster than the men. Analog computers within the plotting room continuously calculated range-bearing wind drift shell flight time and even the curvature of the Earth. By the time Japanese gunners raised their binoculars, the Iowa already knew where they would be 30 seconds later. While Japanese shipbuilders worshipped armor and tradition, American engineers pursued something else: precision. The Yamato, Japan's pride, was larger and heavier, with guns of 18 inches and armor thicker than any other vessel ever built. But she lacked one thing: the Iowa had mastered integration. The Iowa was a symphony of sensors, servos, and gyros, all speaking through mathematics. Her weapons did not merely fire, they computed. In 1944, this difference was no longer theoretical. The war had transformed from a contest of courage into a test of calculation. Japan's admirals still believed victory came from spirit, the Bushido Code, the will of the emperor, the bravery of men. But American admirals believed in something colder and far more relentless: industrial logic. They didn't build ships for honor, they built them for output. By the time the Iowa reached the Pacific, her power plant of 4 General Electric turbines could produce 212,000 horsepower, enough to propel her faster than most destroyers. She was armor and agility combined, the physical embodiment of a nation that treated technology as destiny. She could turn 33 knots while firing broadsides that displaced the ocean around her hull. Inside her machinery decks, boilers glowed with the same heat as a steel mill, converting crude oil into power with industrial efficiency. Even her shells were miracles of manufacturing. Each one consisted of 1/900 pounds of steel casing and 400 pounds of explosive filler, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. At the U.S. Naval Gun Factory in Washington, machinists tested every shell by firing it into reinforced concrete blocks, measuring cracks, angles, and deflection. By 1944, America was producing these shells by the tens of thousands, each identical, each lethal, each a mathematical promise. The difference between Japan and the United States was now visible in the numbers. While Japan could produce perhaps 1 battleship every 2 years, America launched 4. While Japan still relied on optical gunnery, America had integrated radar into over 60 major warships. And while Japanese yards struggled with fuel shortages, American shipyards ran 3 shifts a day, lit by floodlights that made night indistinguishable from day. Admiral Raymond Spruance once described the Iowa as a weapon that speaks the language of industry. When her guns fired, it wasn't just an attack, it was a statement of capacity. Each salvo represented thousands of workers, engineers, and factories synchronized toward a single purpose. On the eve of the Leyte Gulf operation, Japanese intelligence reported that the Americans were escorting their carriers with fast battleships. The phrase itself sounded contradictory. To the Imperial Navy, no battleship could ever be fast. But to the Americans, speed was the new armor. A warship that could strike and vanish before a counterfire arrived was invincible, not because of superstition, but because of physics. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyota Soemu still believed in decisive battle, the idea that one climactic engagement could reverse Japan's fortunes. But the Iowa class was built to make that idea obsolete. These ships didn't wait for a decisive battle. They created it at will, from any distance, at any hour. When steel spoke louder than strategy, the old codes of warfare, honor, bravery, and fate were replaced by mathematics, electricity, and industrial firepower. And on that October night, the men of Iowa were about to prove that no amount of courage could outrun a 2,700-pound shell traveling faster than sound. The order came just before dawn. The Iowa's radar team confirmed 3 large surface contacts heading north-northeast at 25 knots, remnants of the Japanese center force attempting to escape through the San Bernardino Strait. The sea was calm, the horizon pale with early light, and the range read 35 kilometers. Captain McCrea leaned over the plotting table. "We have the range. Let's finish this." Deep within the armored belly of the Iowa, hundreds of men moved in practiced rhythm. Powder bags, each weighing 90 pounds, were carried on conveyor belts toward the gun rooms. Shell hoists clanked upward through the steel decks, lifting projectiles taller than a man. Inside Turret 2, the chief gunner yelled, "Load!" and the 16-inch Mark 7 gun swallowed the shell with mechanical precision. The smell of cordite and oil filled the air. Every man within 50 feet knew to open his mouth slightly to keep his eardrums from bursting when the gun fired. Above them, the Mark 8 radar locked on target. Its green oscillating line traced the faint silhouette of a cruiser across the distant waves. The computing room translated the radar data into angles and bearings, feeding the Mark 38 fire control system. The ship's analog brain gears, gyros, and servo motors calculated flight time, shell dispersion, and target motion. Within seconds, the solution was ready. The gunnery officer pressed his thumb to the trigger key and reported, "Solution set. Target Japanese heavy cruiser bearing 320 degrees range, 35 kilometers." On the open deck, the world held its breath. Then a flash like lightning. The Iowa's 9 guns roared as one. The sound was not a simple explosion, it was a physical force that struck the body. Men on nearby ships described it as standing inside a thunderclap. The entire battleship shuddered backward as a cloud of flame and smoke swallowed her bow. The recoil drove shock waves across the ocean, flattening waves for hundreds of meters. High above, the shells soared into the stratosphere. Each one traced a ballistic arc higher than Mount Everest, invisible to the naked eye, traveling faster than sound. 40 seconds later, the horizon flickered. One explosion, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession. A tower of fire climbed into the sky, orange against the pale dawn. Through his binoculars, the Iowa's spotter officer whispered, "Hit. Direct hit." On the Japanese cruiser, Kumano confusion erupted. At 06:55, the lookout shouted warnings of incoming shells, but no aircraft were visible. Then the first impact. A shell slammed through the aft deck, penetrating 3 layers of armor before detonating near the engine room. The blast tore open the starboard side, killing dozens instantly. Fire rolled through the passageways, devouring oxygen. The ship heeled sharply to port as secondary explosions shook the hull. Lieutenant Harada, the navigation officer aboard Kumano, later recalled in his diary, "We saw no planes, no ships. Only the sea turning white with spray, and the sound of thunder without end." The gunnery officer shouted that it was impossible. No enemy battleship could fire accurately from beyond 20 miles. Yet as they argued, another shell hit forward of the bridge, collapsing the deck like paper. Within minutes, communication lines failed. The bridge lost contact with the engine room. Flooding spread through the lower compartments. Men attempted to seal bulkheads, but the pressure from each explosion warped the steel doors. The ship's damage control officer ordered counter-flooding to stabilize the list, but the pumps were dead. By 07:10, Kumano was barely moving. Back aboard, the Iowa data poured into the fire control computer. Spotter planes circling overhead transmitted corrections, 50 yards short shift, 2 degrees north. The next salvo landed perfectly. Through the haze, the gunners could see the Japanese cruiser's bow lifting from the water smoke boiling from the midsection. The Mark 38 director tracked the dying ship with cold precision. Each adjustment meant another burst of flame, another piece of steel twisted beyond recognition. For the Americans, it was execution by geometry. For the Japanese, it was revelation through horror. They had believed armor could save them, that battles were decided by courage and proximity. But now, from 35 kilometers away, a single American ship was rewriting every rule they had lived by. The ocean between them offered no safety. It was simply empty space, waiting to be measured and filled with fire. When the firing ceased, the Iowa's deck was coated with soot and shell residue. The gun barrels glowed dull red from the heat. The air smelled of ozone and burned metal. Down below, the analog computers hummed softly, their gears still spinning, ready for the next target. The crew moved methodically, resetting, cleaning, preparing. No cheers, no celebration, only discipline. They knew the math had spoken, and its verdict was absolute. At 07:20, reports came through radio intercept a Japanese cruiser aflame, listing heavily abandoning ship. The radar operators confirmed the echo fading into scattered debris. 6 shells. That was all it took. 6 shells that traveled more than 20 miles, guided not by eyesight or luck, but by a machine's certainty. Far to the west, survivors from Kumano floated among the wreckage, stunned and silent. Some whispered prayers to the emperor, others simply stared at the rising sun reflected in the oil-slicked waves. They had not even seen their enemy. The attack had come from beyond sight, beyond comprehension. In that moment, for the first time, Japan's Navy understood what it meant to fight a nation that had turned science itself into a weapon. By mid-morning, the Philippine Sea had turned into a graveyard of smoke and drifting debris. The Japanese center force was in retreat, scattered and broken after the battle off Samar, but its surviving ships were about to face an even more devastating blow, not from aircraft or torpedoes, but from the simple realization that the ocean no longer protected them. Aboard the Kumano, the deck was slick with burning oil. The ship's forward turret had been sheared off the gun barrels, pointing uselessly toward the sky. Survivors clung to the twisted railing, coughing through smoke thick as fog. The ship's list had increased to 20 degrees. The engineering officer, Lieutenant Yoshida, tried to restart the pumps manually, his face blackened with soot. But every command line, every wire, every pump shaft had been bent or severed by the concussive force of the Iowa's shells. He would later recall, it was as if the sea itself had turned against us. There was nowhere to run. Across the radio network, confusion reigned. Cruiser Suzuya, which had been nearby, reported multiple heavy-caliber impacts from unknown origin. Destroyers Nowaki and Shimakaze transmitted fragmented coordinates before losing contact entirely. Japanese signal operators thought they were being jammed by American aircraft. They could not imagine that the noise flooding their receivers was shock interference from radar-guided naval gunfire. In Tokyo, headquarters received the first garbled reports around noon. The messages were contradictory. Some claimed air attack, others insisted it was submarine torpedoes. No one believed a single battleship could deliver that kind of destruction from over 20 miles away. Admiral Toyota demanded confirmation. The response from Vice Admiral Kurita, his voice weary and cracked through static, was short enemy guns. Too far to see, too accurate to fight. That line, too accurate to fight, spread through the ranks of Japan's Navy like an infection. For decades, their doctrine had been built on decisive battle fleets facing each other with invisible range gunners, guided by optics, and instinct captains maneuvering by intuition. But the Iowa had fired from beyond the horizon, guided not by men's eyes, but by machines. Every principle the Japanese Navy had trained for was suddenly obsolete. The survivors from Kumano watched their ship slowly die. At 08:05, a secondary explosion erupted in the aft magazine. The blast sent steel fragments across the deck like shrapnel from a giant grenade. The hull groaned, twisting under its own weight. The captain, realizing the ship could not be saved, gave the order, "Abandon ship." The words came too late for many. As lifeboats hit the water, another shell struck near the bow, throwing a column of spray and flame into the air. Moments later, Kumano rolled to starboard and slipped beneath the surface, leaving behind a spreading field of oil-burning debris and men struggling against waves. Miles away aboard the Iowa, the bridge crew watched through binoculars as the distant smoke faded. The radar display showed only fragments, echoes, dissolving into noise. The gunnery officer removed his headset and exhaled. "No return signal," he said quietly. "Target destroyed." Captain McCrea nodded once. "Cease fire!" There were no cheers, no triumph. The men knew what they had done, but they also knew what it meant. For the Japanese, it was more than a loss. It was a psychological collapse. Officers who had once believed in divine protection now stared at the ocean in disbelief. The sea, their oldest ally, had betrayed them. Their ships were no longer dueling knights, but targets on a grid. The enemy was not courage or skill, but a cold equation that no prayer could alter. In the days that followed, rumors swept through the Imperial Navy. Some claimed the Americans had developed magnetic projectiles that followed ships like homing weapons. Others whispered that they had harnessed radio waves to bend trajectories. None could accept that what had happened was the product of pure engineering, radar precision, industrial consistency, and relentless testing. American intelligence later intercepted Japanese communications describing the incident as an unseen bombardment. The phrasing was revealing it was not the damage that terrified them, but the invisibility of it. To be struck without ever seeing the attacker was an affront to everything they understood about war. At Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier, Japan had proven that surprise could cripple even a giant. But in 1944, the United States had perfected a new kind of surprise, one measured repeatable and industrial. The shock wave that spread through the Japanese Navy after the Kumano's destruction was not just fear of firepower, it was fear of irrelevance. Aboard the Iowa that evening, the sea was calm again. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the water red and gold. Sailors on deck cleaned the soot from the gun barrels. One young loader, barely 19, leaned against the rail and stared into the fading light. "We never even saw their faces," he murmured. The petty officer beside him replied, "That's the point. They never saw ours either." In Tokyo, Admiral Toyoda wrote in his diary that night, "If one shell can reach farther than our eyes, then the age of warriors has ended." The Iowa's 6 shells had done more than destroy a ship. They had erased a doctrine, shattered a belief system, and proved that courage alone could no longer win wars. The sea had spoken, and it spoke in the language of steel and radar. In the aftermath of the battle, the Iowa's decks were quiet. The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered, and a thin layer of soot covered the brass fittings, turning everything the color of war. Deep within the hull, engineers checked bearings, recalibrated servo motors, and logged barrel wear with pencil marks on oil-stained charts. There was no celebration, only maintenance. Victory aboard a ship like this was measured in precision, not emotion. Among the crew was Ensign Harold Kent, a 24-year-old fire control officer from Ohio. Before the war, he had been a math teacher. Now he sat in front of the Mark 8 computer, surrounded by spinning gears and whirring gyroscopes, calculating trajectories that could decide the fate of thousands. It was strange, he later wrote in a letter to his brother. "I never saw the enemy, never heard them. Just numbers, range, bearing, deflection. You feed the machine, and the machine delivers death." The men who powered the Iowa were not warriors in the ancient sense. They were technicians, machinists, electricians, ordinary Americans turned into instruments of a vast industrial orchestra. In the ammunition hoists, sailors in sweat-soaked shirts passed 90-pound powder bags hand to hand. In the engine room, the heat was unbearable, the roar of turbines constant. Yet every valve turned, every bolt tightened, every calculation made was part of the same equation: convert labor into force intelligence into fire. Lieutenant William Briggs, the ship's chief gunnery engineer, once described the process with clinical detachment. "Our weapons didn't just work," they reasoned. "The radar gave us the eyes, the computer gave us the brain, and the crew provided the hands." It was this combination of machine logic and human discipline that turned the Iowa into something beyond comprehension for her enemies. Back home, the hands that made those machines were no less extraordinary. In the foundries of Pennsylvania, women in welding masks shaped the gun barrels that now glowed red over the Pacific. In Detroit, factory workers assembled fire control servos with the same care once reserved for luxury cars. In Kansas, teenage girls packed powder bags under the supervision of engineers who measured every ounce for uniform burn rate. None of them would ever see the ocean, yet their fingerprints were on every explosion. For every Iowa-class shell fired, there were 1,000 unseen actions behind it. Designers drafting blueprints, machinists machining tolerances to 1/10,000th of an inch, railroad workers shipping steel from mill to dock. When those 6 shells left the Iowa's guns, they carried within them the sum total of America's industrial soul. On the bridge, Captain McCrea understood this in a way few others did. He had served long enough to remember when naval battles were duels of will and chance. Now standing beside a humming radar console, he realized he commanded not men in a fight, but a process, an enormous living system that began in a steel mill and ended in a fireball miles away. "We weren't fighting sailors anymore," he later told a reporter. "We were fighting nations as factories." For the Japanese, the same realization was devastating. Survivors from Kumano were rescued days later by destroyers that still smelled of fuel and smoke. One petty officer wrote in his journal, "We fought as warriors, they fought as engineers. We could not match them because we could not build them." The human equation of the Pacific War was cruelly simple. The stronger the machinery became, the smaller the individual seemed. A gunner's accuracy mattered less than the precision of a lathe back in Illinois. A captain's courage meant little against radar-guided shells. In this new kind of war, emotion had been replaced by calibration, and yet, amid the mechanical perfection, traces of humanity endured. In the mess hall that evening, sailors shared black coffee and stale bread, speaking softly about home. Someone mentioned that the guns had fired fewer shells than expected. Another said he'd seen something burning far off, but wasn't sure if it was a ship or an oil slick. No one used the word kill. They simply nodded, finished their coffee, and went back to their stations. That night, as the Iowa steamed eastward, Ensign Kent stood alone on deck, watching the reflection of the moon shimmer over the black water. He thought about the men on the other side, those who never saw the shells coming. "Maybe they believed they were safe because they couldn't see us," he wrote in his diary. "We believed we were right because we could." He didn't know it yet, but historians would later call that night the turning point in modern naval warfare, the moment when human instinct finally surrendered to industrial precision. From that point on, victory belonged not to the bravest, but to the most efficient. In the weeks that followed, silence covered the Imperial Navy like a burial shroud. Official communiques described the Kumano's loss as damage due to aerial attack, avoiding any mention of radar-guided gunfire. Within Tokyo's naval ministry, the truth was whispered only behind closed doors. The reports that reached Admiral Toyota were clinical and devastating. 6 shells, all hits, all fired from beyond visual range. The Admiral read the words twice, then set the page down. "We were not defeated by courage," he said quietly. "We were defeated by calculation." For decades, Japan's military doctrine had revolved around the concept of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Its admirals believed that through discipline, willpower, and tactical brilliance, a smaller fleet could destroy a larger one. That faith had guided every ship built, every sailor trained. But the Iowa's salvo proved that decisive battles no longer required proximity or bravery. They required production lines, factories, and algorithms. The age of the warrior had been replaced by the age of the machine. The intelligence division compiled what little data they had. Reports from survivors described explosions that came without warning, impacts that ignored armor angles, and shockwaves so intense they warped bulkheads before detonation. Analysts compared shell fragments recovered from debris. Each piece bore identical machining marks, proof that the Americans were producing weapons with industrial precision, not artisanal variants. Every shell, one report noted bitterly, is perfect. That word perfect haunted Japan's engineers. Perfection required repetition, and repetition required power fuel steel and labor things Japan no longer possessed. Their shipyards were running at a fraction of capacity. Electrical blackouts crippled production. Bombing raids had destroyed aluminum plants. Even if they designed a countermeasure, they could never mass-produce it fast enough. For every one Japanese shell, cast America forged 50. The psychological impact ran deeper than any physical loss. Naval officers who had once recited poetry about Bushido now spoke of mathematics with dread. To face the Americans was to face inevitability itself, a process so vast and efficient that individual bravery dissolved into insignificance. One officer reportedly said, "We trained men to fight. They trained machines to think. How do you fight a nation that no longer depends on men?" Across the Pacific, American analysts studying intercepted Japanese traffic recognized the change in tone. Radio messages grew shorter, less confident, more mechanical. Gone were the flowery phrases of imperial pride. In their place came cold coordinates and evacuation orders. Admiral Nimitz, reading these reports, understood what it meant. The enemy had finally grasped that the war was no longer a duel of fleets, but a collision of economies. Back in the United States, newspapers celebrated the victories at Leyte Gulf and the destruction of Japan's surface fleet. Few readers understood what really happened that night. They saw headlines about heroic gunnery and unsurpassed marksmanship, not the reality that machines had begun making decisions faster than men could think. To the American public, it was proof of their nation's might. To Japan's admirals, it was the end of an era. Admiral Toyota ordered the surviving officers of the center force to Tokyo for debriefing. In the meeting, he asked a simple question: why did our armor fail? The room was silent until an older engineer answered, "It did not fail, Admiral. It was simply irrelevant." Outside Japan's naval headquarters, winter winds swept through the city. The same wind carried the smell of burning fuel from nearby shipyards struck by American bombers. The empire that had once dreamed of dominating the Pacific now faced the cold arithmetic of defeat. Courage could not outpace production. Faith could not deflect radar. The ocean, once their sanctuary, had become the world's largest firing range. On the Iowa, life went on. The guns were cleaned, the radar recalibrated, the ship refueled and reassigned to bombard coastal targets. For her crew, the 6 shells fired that morning were already history. For Japan, they were prophecy. In that single exchange of fire, the nation had seen its future, a world where technology erased distance and machines decided outcomes long before men could act. When the war ended less than a year later, Japan's naval archives were opened to Allied investigators. Among the documents was a short handwritten note believed to be Toyota's final wartime reflection. It read, "We built ships for heroes. They built systems. The heroes died. The systems endured." In retrospect, historians would mark the Iowa's salvo as the moment when the industrial age reached its ultimate expression. It was not just the destruction of a ship, it was the destruction of an idea that war could still be won by valor. After that day, steel and circuitry replaced myth and glory. The sea no longer favored the brave, it favored the efficient. And as the last echoes of those 6 shells faded into the depths they carried with them, the end of an empire and the beginning of a new world, one where machines spoke louder than men. If you've watched until this point, consider this: how much of history was truly written by courage and how much by calculation? Comment 1, if you believe industrial power decides wars. Like if you still believe human will can change destiny. And don't forget to subscribe for the next story of how machines, not men, change the fate of nations.